Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go. Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I am Tracy Stuckrath, your host of Eating at a Meeting and the founder of Thrive Meetings and Events. And here on this show, I talk to experts in all facets of food and beverage about how to create safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences. And from doctors to farmers to chefs and a variety of other people. I'm actually coming to you live from Cabo. I'm here presenting to a group of incentive meeting professionals on how to do the same thing when they're planning incentive trips. But I could not miss the podcast because I'm so excited to talk to my friend Jen Jobrak, who was previously the head of advocacy and education for food allergy research and education, where she led FAIR's successful efforts on more than 100 pieces of legislation pertaining to the safety of people with food allergies, with life-threatening food allergies. She is a good allergy mom and spouse and has an unusual food allergy herself. And her current company that she runs is Food Allergy Pros. So, hey, Jen.
Hi, Tracy. How are you today?
I am good. How are you?
I'm doing okay, thanks.
Good. I listened to you on a webinar a couple of weeks ago for the Food Equality Initiative, our friend Emily Brown. Mm-hmm. And we're talking about laws. And I reached out because there's so many things to think about this. And I don't want to focus on the laws, but I think people should be aware of the laws that are around food and beverage.
Right. Sure.
And you've done 100 pieces of legislation around food allergies.
Yeah.
So can you talk to us about what some of these regulations are? Because were you involved in Food Allergy Labeling and Consumer Protection Act as well? Or was that before that?
I was not involved in the passage of that law, but I certainly was involved in the implementation of that law.
Okay, great.
So I think there are laws that affect the food allergy community and the preparation of foods for folks with food allergies at the federal level. Mm-hmm. And there are some safety and inclusion laws really that are promulgated at the state level. So maybe I'll take a moment and just touch on both of those.
Yeah.
At the federal level, the three most important pieces of legislation for folks with food allergies, specifically for food allergies, would be the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act, which was signed into law in 2004. And this law was the law that benchmarked and established that the 8 most common food allergens in the U.S., those that are responsible for 90% of all food allergies, need to be labeled explicitly on packaged foods, either in the ingredient list or in the contained statement. And just for folks to remember, those would be peanuts, tree nuts, which is a whole category, right? Mm-hmm. Eggs, milk, wheat, finfish, shellfish, and soy.
Okay.
That was in 2004. Now we're fast forward to 2011, and food safety concerns, but actually being proactive. And this was not just about food allergies. This was about laws governing foodborne pathogens, hazards such as foreign objects in food, glass shards or what have you, anything that could end up in a packaged food. And that act, FSMA, put hazard controls in place for food allergies as well.
Okay.
The most recent piece of legislation, which folks may have heard about, is the FASTER Act, which was signed into law just a few weeks ago. And this did 2 things for the food allergy community. Number one, it added sesame to that list of top 8 that I mentioned a moment ago. So now there are 9 allergens that must be labeled explicitly in ingredient labels or in contained statements effective in 2023. Okay. And the second thing it did is it made it easier in the future for new allergens to be added to labeling requirements, because the efforts to add sesame to this list were years long, took the FDA doing things, Congress doing things, some confusion over who had jurisdiction. So it clarifies that.
And it required the president to sign it.
Well, of course, yeah, all the laws do, right? Yeah. So that was a big deal for the community, and I had the privilege of working on very early drafts of that bill a few years back. Those are really the federal pieces that are in place that anyone working in the food industry is probably already aware of, and certainly the food allergy community is as well. I'm not even mentioning the Americans with Disabilities Act and the whole rubric around accommodating people with food allergies, because food allergy is considered a disability in many circumstances because it affects one or more major life functions, mainly eating and breathing.
Right.
When you get into safety and inclusion, I think this is interesting for folks that are doing events around the country, because there is a patchwork of laws related to what you are required to do in a venue and what you are permitted to do in a venue.
Okay.
So one example I'll give is the availability of stock epinephrine. So stock epinephrine, as folks may know, epinephrine, the common brand is EpiPen, although there are other brands. This is the only medication that can stop the symptoms of a severe reaction, of an escalating reaction. And it is recommended that if you are diagnosed with food allergy, you carry 2 auto-injectors with you at all times. But sometimes people forget, or they may not know they have an allergy to a food they've not encountered before. Or sometimes you can develop an allergy midlife. That is happening more and more. So there's laws around the country that in some states, and I'll take schools, for instance, about a dozen states or so require all schools to stock epinephrine, and 39 states allow schools to stock. So it's less than a dozen that require, because Hawaii has no legislation. So those are permitted to stock but are not required. And then there are another group of laws that permit but do not require other kinds of entities to stock. And that can include college campuses, that can include banquet halls, that can include country clubs and community centers. So that's a big and important piece. And then the last thing I'll say about this for now is that there's also about a dozen or more than a dozen states that have laws in place regarding what restaurants and food service establishments are required to do for customers with food allergy. Training, what training they need to receive, what topics the training needs to cover, how the efforts to protect people with food allergies are communicated to patrons, what notifications are put on menus and the like. And it behooves anyone working in any state to be familiar with those laws. And I would argue it makes good sense, if you operate a venue, to consider getting a standing order to stock epinephrine in the event that there is an anaphylactic emergency.
Yeah, I was just telling this group of planners too, like, it's make sure that you're asking those questions, because they are allowed to, but it's also important to note too, in the states, that some EMTs are not allowed to carry it or administer it. A certain level of EMT has to come to the site.
So people are very surprised to learn that many ambulances do not stock epinephrine. We did a project on this a few years ago, and without getting into the weeds, there are different levels of ambulances, right? There's advanced life support, there's basic life support. And when one calls 911, which is the right thing to do if there's an emergency, right? That is the right thing to do. You may expect that the folks staffing the vehicle will show up, will recognize anaphylaxis, and know what to do and specifically give epinephrine. And in many cases, they're not authorized to do so. It's normally a paramedic, someone who has the most advanced level of training, and sometimes an advanced EMT who has the authorization to administer stock epinephrine, which is usually kept on the vehicle in a vial and administered with a syringe. some basic EMTs are permitted to help a patient administer his or her own epinephrine.
Okay.
But you don't necessarily know that when you call.
Right. Yeah.
And there are ways to familiarize yourself with that. Every state has an Office of Emergency Management Services and can tell you kind of, what the statutes are in that state. That piece is a little bit hard to find. I get calls about that to this day, and I'm happy to answer those questions if folks have them about which states do what. But it's worth when you, God forbid, you have to call 911 saying we have someone we suspect an allergic reaction. If in to send a rig that has epinephrine stocked on it, and sometimes that does improve the responsiveness. Right.
Yeah. And then, which is also important because you don't know how far away that ambulance actually is, or that EMT, in the response time as well. So
that's right.
Yeah. And I was just when I was talking to the planners earlier, I'm like, you need to ask your attendees too, if they carry it. And because, a lot of I met a woman the other night, she doesn't carry it. She carries Benadryl, which we're not going to go into that conversation, but she doesn't carry it with her because she knows what she can and cannot eat. So she makes sure that she communicates that, but still, right now we're in a foreign country. I would be really kind of scared not to have it, in a foreign country and not be able to administer it because you don't know what's going to happen.
Well, here's another issue that we're seeing. First of all, I will say that for adults who've lived with food allergy for decades, it's not uncommon to hear that they don't carry auto-inject epinephrine on them because they've gotten along fine without it. And it was a little harder to get 30, 40, 50 years ago, if at all. So we hear a lot of that, I don't need it. I've never needed it. Therefore, I will never need it, which of course is heartbreaking for me to hear because you don't know when you're going to need it. I also hear, I only have a mild allergy. I've only just gotten hives. And regrettably, when we look at fatalities in food allergy, it is often because people think because they've only had mild reactions in the past, they will only have mild reactions in the future. And we've seen people with history of mild reactions suddenly have a life-threatening or even a fatal catastrophic reaction. The last thing I'll say about that piece is because of the huge disruptions in our supply chain, a lot of vendors are making substitutions. Right. And therefore, the incidence, for even a kitchen or just a vendor of a packaged food to know precisely what's in their food and what the risk of cross contact has been, it's a little bit different now. Right. It's not as predictable. Even the FDA issued a temporary ruling last year at the start of COVID, lifting some labeling requirements, changing labeling requirements for grocery items. So just because you know what you can and cannot eat doesn't mean, and just maybe you've ordered the same thing 10 times and on the 11th time there's a substitution that could be a problem for you. Right. So yes.
And exactly. Or there's a story of me. I was actually in Florida at an event, and the label it was a green juice, and it said kale and other things, and it was a green juice. And I took the hotel's word of what was on that label, right? But I drank it, and it was frothy, and it had pineapple. I could taste the pineapple. I went back and looked at the label. It didn't say pineapple on it. I'm like, okay, I still drank it, which was stupid. But I went back a second time, and a server was pulling out a piece of paper out of her pocket, and she had scribbled down what she saw the chef put in the drink, because there was another person asking as well when I went back the second time. And come to find out after the fact is that they had 2 recipes with the same name, and chefs changed in the middle of that service. And one chef started making the other one with pineapple in it. And they didn't change the label out on the front. And so that's a whole nother level of, ingredients change.
Absolutely. And If restaurants are short-staffed,
Mm-hmm.
we know many of them are now. Event venues are having trouble hiring folks as well.
Mm-hmm.
People might be more rushed. They might be more hurried. And I want to be very clear. No one's doing this maliciously or malevolently. They're trying to get a lot of food out the door.
Right.
So sometimes mistakes can be made. So, yeah.
Yeah. So now I wanted to ask another question about, because I saw online there's another level, the food labeling or the food labeling, the Modernization Act is getting amended this year, or there's some changes that pertain to gluten. Is that right?
Right. So the folks with
Food Safety Modernization Act.
So there is some movement. The Food Safety Modernization Act, again, I could get into the weeds, it would bore everybody. But while wheat has been singled out as a labeled allergen, there are other gluten-containing grains that are not often called out. Rye, barley, there are others. Spelt. Right. So there is new legislation, or it's currently being considered in Congress, that would require the delineation of these gluten-containing grains as well. So that really is more relevant to folks who have celiac disease or gluten intolerance, not an IgE-mediated anaphylactic. Although I know there are people. I'm aware of folks who have severe allergies to barley, rye, etc.
Right.
So that's what that would be about, and that's pending right now.
Okay. And I know that, and there's gluten-free labeling laws that is separate from the allergen labeling laws. And so we have to learn the rule, to read the labels and understand the labels, but sometimes those labels are hard to understand because manufacturers are not necessarily clear about how that works. And then you've got your CYA statements of may contain and processed in a facility.
Well, I would take issue that they're all CYA statements.
Well, that's true.
Because there are data. FDA did a study years ago, some academic institutions as well. I've seen numbers that let's say a product that can, I'll give you for instance, which is dark chocolate.
Okay.
Made in the U.S. I've seen that upwards of 7 out of 10 samples of dark chocolate in one study, 7 out of 10 contained detectable amounts of milk.
Wow.
Now, if you're, as I am, a lover of dark chocolate, you want the pure chocolate, and you might think, oh, this is safe for me. It's not going to have any milk in it.
Right.
And I do know families whose children have dairy allergy who are comfortable with dark chocolate. It's not required to list the may contain statement may actually be valid in this case. It may contain milk. In the UK, they use this different phrasing. They say this product is not suitable for people with blank allergy. I think the may contain labeling or the made on shared equipment or made in the same facility labeling, people have to understand that is completely at the discretion of the manufacturer, whether to include that statement, how to phrase that statement, where to locate that statement, and who gets to write that statement. Is it someone intimately familiar with the manufacturing process? Is it an attorney? Is it a marketing or packaging person?
Right.
So I always encourage folks, if they really are interested in a product, to make a call, to go on a website. The benefit of the internet now is there's a lot more information out there.
Right.
So you're right. And there's if I can say one more thing, gluten-free does have a regulatory definition. Dairy-free, milk-free, peanut-free, egg-free, etc. do not. That's
a really good delineation to make sure that people understand that. Yeah. Because the dairy-free has to come under contains dairy, right?
There's a distinction between non-dairy and dairy-free. And I think, there's the ability to include certain proteins that are derived from milk and still use that terminology. So you can have people with dairy allergy, or with milk allergy, I should say, who may still have allergic reactions. And it's kind of the wild, wild west. I've seen products labeled, for instance, peanut-free, right on the front in big bold letters, and you turn it around and there's a may contain peanut statement or made in the same facility as peanut statement on the back. They're not in the wrong. I think they're misleading. I think it's dangerous, but they're not violating any regulatory framework.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Let's hope that's dealt with at some point.
Right, exactly. Let's hope. Okay, so one of the questions that you and I were talking about before the show was, why are food allergies not taken as seriously as other life-threatening diseases and are made fun of? And just before you answer that, I remember Celiac and the Beast. She was like on the podcast a couple months ago. She's like, why is it that something that could kill me or that can harm me seriously is a problem for you, right?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So do you have any, based on your experience, what are your thoughts on that?
So one thought is that while it's a life-threatening disease, it's not a linear progression of a life-threatening disease. So it's episodic.
Okay,
it's not like other life-threatening diseases that regrettably someone may decline over time, or it has a universal understanding of this. Universal understanding that this is a bad diagnosis. Food allergy, you could be fine until you're not fine. If God forbid you have an encounter with your allergen, that's number one. Number two, unlike other medical conditions, food allergy may inconvenience a person who doesn't have that medical condition. So I believe that there's some antagonism toward food allergy, because my food allergy may require you to make accommodations when I'm sitting next to you. I may go out to lunch with you and ask you not to order certain foods. I may send my food allergic child to school, and it may restrict what your child can bring for lunch.
Okay.
That's not true of diabetes, right? That's not true of Crohn's disease, right? And those are terrible diseases, don't get me wrong.
Right.
But I think the antipathy comes from people not understanding that small trace amounts can be problematic. If you look at young children, they may touch a surface that was contaminated with an allergen and then put their fingers in their mouth or their nose. Kids are constantly putting their fingers
on everything,
right? So this means that the entire environment in which a small, young, food allergic child is in school or daycare or some youth program, that entire environment has to be viewed through the lens of, is there a risk to this kid? And there are other kids in that environment. So their choices may be restricted in service to the kid who needs to have certain foods as far away as possible.
Right.
Unfortunately, we've seen over the last year what people's understanding is of shared responsibility in public health and how we protect each other, right?
Right.
Some good ways, some not so good ways. I think the people with food allergies have been living this for a long time, and really not really having to do a lot of education every time you sit down at a new school, with a new employer, with when you're traveling for work on an airplane. These are encounters we have every day. And the last thing I'll say, when you have a food allergy and you go out to eat, let's say, or you are at a meeting, I mean, you encounter this, Tracy, you have to admit personal, intimate medical information to a complete stranger and hope that they know what to do with that information. That's a very awkward position to be in. My 16-year-old has grown up learning to advocate for himself and asking questions. But he's out to lunch and there's a server who may be the same age that he is or a little bit older. And he asks, does this item contain his allergens? And maybe it's a loud restaurant. It's hard to hear, although lately he's only eating outside. But that's a different story. You have to have a conversation that is awkward for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes conflated with, oh, they just don't like peanuts, or, oh, she's annoying because she's living a gluten-free lifestyle. It all gets kind of mixed up. So I think that's where a lot of the antipathy comes from.
Well, yeah. And like, you cannot live without peanuts for an hour on an airplane. Really? I mean, do you have peanuts? Are you eating peanuts every single hour of the day that you have to have them on an airplane for, an hour flight? Right. And so that we see a lot of that in Leanne No Nut Traveler's world as well. And even like this woman that would need a gluten-free muffin, I was like, it was gluten-free vegan. She's like, nope, I like my gluten. And I'm like, it is like a really good muffin. And she's like, nope, sorry, I won't eat it. And I'm like, okay, there's really bad tasting food that has all the allergens in it that you like to eat, I guess, but you're not willing to, and it's just try it. Right.
Right.
Like, just try it.
Right. The quality of gluten-free products has dramatically improved.
Yes.
I mean, I do not need to avoid gluten, and I'm purchasing quite a number of them because they're quite tasty and they're not dry. And
it was like, okay, can you tell me, they gave me a sandwich yesterday. It looked like a sesame seed bun, right? And I'm like, it's gluten-free. And they're like, yeah, it's gluten-free. And so I'm like, can you find out the brand? Because it was actually quite tasty. And granted, it's maybe his Mexican brand. She's like, our pastry chef made that from scratch. I'm like, excuse me. I'm like, it was so good. Yeah. It was, so people are getting better at it, and it's not all cardboard.
That's right. And that's true. I should say that's true for egg-free products, dairy-free products, some of the butter substitutes that are people using in baking and so forth. Yeah. There are many more options than there used to be. But I think it really speaks to kind of the social compact. Are we taking care of each other? Yeah. And is it really that hard for you to do without your peanut M&Ms for a 45-minute commuter flight?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So my friend Lynn posted this up here. Her friend is allergic to eggs, and they had margaritas, and the restaurant used egg whites to make the salt stick to the glass.
Wow.
Who knew?
So that is interesting.
Yeah.
I hope her friend is okay.
Yes, Lynn, please tell us that she's okay.
There's a whole other conversation to be had about labeling in alcohol. This sounds like it was done at the restaurant, but this is why, it's a big burden. I'm not going to minimize it, to ask every time with every order, especially some of the more ubiquitous allergens, soy, egg, milk. Those are the three that I think are more insidious because they're used in more hidden places. Although we had a peanut situation last week in coleslaw. Who knew?
Who knew? Yeah.
Yeah, that was weird and yucky. But sometimes, and here's the thing, sometimes the server doesn't know, right? Or they might forget. Maybe someone prepped the glasses a while ago, or the bartender did it and then went off shift, and who knows? So there's a fair bit of leaps of faith.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm just going to that. I mean, egg wash is used on pretzels to put the salts and things like that, but I would never. And there was a case of a woman in London who ordered a drink and they used raw egg in it, and she didn't know it and went into anaphylactic shock there. And the restaurant had labeled the food part of the menu, but not the bar part of the menu.
Right.
And she will never go back there. But the owner is like, oh my God, I'm changing all of my menus. Right. So he saw the negligence or the mistake, but is doing something about it at the same time.
Well, and the UK has some liability laws in place for if restaurants there have been instances where restaurants have been found negligent. So I'm not surprised to hear your friend Lynn did post that she's fine. Your friend is fine. So I'm happy to hear that. Alcohol is an interesting topic generally. There are nut derivatives. There are seed derivatives. It uses flavorings in alcohol. Medication is another area. Oral medication where labeling laws are incomplete at best and pretty much lacking. So one example is that a lot of flavorings that are used to flavor liquid medication that children take, some of them you have like dairy derivatives or other.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And there's not a lot of regulation around labeling of inactive ingredients in medication, both over the counter and prescriptions. And you might have an obscure allergy. The active ingredients need to be labeled, but the inactive ones, mainly the flavorings, if the capsule that you're consuming is made out of a gelatin, that the gelatin has some animal derivative or soy derivative, lecithin, sometimes these can be problematic for people.
Well, and very true. And I was at this event last night and they made the gelatin and I'm like, okay, so what did you make your gelatin out of? I was trying to find out if the dish was vegan, which I know I should have known better because I didn't get part of it because it contained dairy in it. But I was curious about the gelatin she made. I'm like, did you use agar-agar, to make it vegan? And she's like, no, it was gelatin. And I didn't go further into that, but I'm like, can you do it other ways? And you can, but it's also teaching a new kind of thing. All right. So let's see. And I just wanted to say that a couple of months ago, and I don't know if you know him, but in episode 40 of this show, I interviewed Camper English, and he is a mixologist. He's dedicated to cocktail ingredients and techniques, and he has a website called Cocktail Safe. And so he's teaching bartenders about the hidden ingredients in different cocktails and
I love that.
And alcohols. Yeah. And so if you guys can check it out, I'll post a link on it here. But so this other person said, it's exciting to observe how the quality and presentation of special meals have dramatically improved. Often some guests without allergies would prefer to have the special dietary options because that they want those instead of the regular meals, which is somewhat true and somewhat frustrating for planners as well as chefs because they run out of the personalized plates or the specialized plates because somebody who doesn't have a food allergy is like, oh, I want one Jen's eating. Right. And well, no, this was only personalized for Tracy but they have some places have gotten better, not all. And I would say 90% are not better.
I think what this conversation underlines is that while there are improvements and clarifications in how food needs to be labeled, and how products that event planners use need to be labeled for allergen specifically, there is still an enormous obligation and onus both on the person with food allergy and on the person serving and working with the person with food allergy to have extremely specific and clarifying questions and conversation. Labeling can't pick all of that up, especially if chefs, for whatever reason, have to make a substitution because they've run out of something, because their usual supplier is unavailable, because they've had COVID has really upended, as you know very well, and as your listeners know, it's upended so many aspects of event planning and dining out and any food service, be it at a college campus or a school. And some of those improvements have been good. Some of those things have been improvements. So, for instance, schools are now getting a lot more packaged foods in the door than the lunch line. And so parents with food allergies parents of kids with food allergies have a better time reading the ingredient list before they send their kid off to school that day. But by and large, the improvement in legislation, and I'm happy to have been a part of it, to see a lot of it, is not a substitute for the due diligence that has to happen with each conversation.
Yeah. And so something that you said in there triggered a thought, because when I know we've only been talking for 30 minutes and I forgot maybe what you said 5 minutes ago, but, thinking that, the diligence is look at the menu online, call the restaurant in advance and let them know that you have a food allergy, to communicate that. And then, when you get there, the hostess says something about that reservation or the server acknowledges it, et cetera. But for meeting planners, I'm like, you are the hostess, you are the order taker, you are the communicator to the chef. And so the due diligence and the duty of care has just elevated. But I also think I have this slide that I use. It's the event food chain, and it's attendee, meeting planner, convention services manager, chef, line cook, server, bartender. It's everybody's responsibility in that, to make sure that the meal is served safely. But it's also a challenge at the same time. Communication.
It's very true. I've advised clients on this very issue because it's important to make room for those individual conversations. There are some things that event planners can do on the front end, in registration forms, in publishing, to the extent you can, menus and ingredients ahead of time, if that is an option. Seeing if the venue where the event will be held has had what kind of food allergy training they have had, and there are some excellent vendors around the country who go into kitchens, who do those kinds of audits and best practice. I've done some of that work. I know some other folks who have, and really, 1 out of every 13 kids currently is estimated to have a food allergy. And it's about 10% of the adult population as well. And we're seeing kids who were diagnosed 15, 20 years ago moving into the work world. Employees are asking these questions of their employers. They're asking it in employee dining. They're asking it when they're sent in, the pre and post COVID world, let's hope, when they're traveling for work. Employers also now have this responsibility, right? Which is, can I send my staff to these meetings, to these conferences, and know that they will be safe? So if you're an event planner and you're working with a venue, perhaps for the first time, I would want to see, one of the fundamental questions is, how do you train your staff on medical dietary conditions, as well as perhaps other dietary preferences, but certainly medical dietary conditions, particularly food allergies, celiac disease, diabetes, etc. If you are a venue and you haven't gone through that kind of training, get that kind of training.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure. Well, and you were talking about the liability. There is a law in London, and I might get this wrong, but it's like the corporate compliance. No, that's corporate compliance and ethics. Homicide Act. And if you're traveling for work and you get harmed while you're traveling for work, the company is liable for that. And, or if you corporate homicide and something, and I'll look it up and let you guys know, but it's amazing. And so even if you're an event planner and you're having your event in London or in the UK, and somebody has a food allergic reaction and dies, or has a food reaction, the company's liable for that. The company they work for is liable for that, because that basically is an OSHA. To me, that's a workplace experience, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I had a project some time ago with a major Fortune 50 employer who offers on-site, on-campus dining for its employees.
Uh-huh.
And they had several incidents where employees had anaphylactic episodes at work, having consumed food prepared at work. And they said we did a huge project to improve their safety. And this one member of the team there said, I don't want, when I go to conferences with my peers at other companies, I want to be able to tell them, don't wait for this to happen.
Right.
And I know, of course, the work world has been so different this last year and a half. Many folks don't go to the office, and on-site dining is severely restricted, but there's still some fundamental issues that in the future will need to be addressed on this topic as well.
Yeah, definitely. And Francois here, he's a chef in South Africa, and he wants to see more chefs expand the special restricted dietary requirements in volume. And you're correct. And a large number of guests are not even aware of their allergies or intolerances, for sure. I mean, even, there's the story of that young girl who ate a cashew on a plane and had never, didn't know she was allergic, and they had to do an emergency landing to go back. And because she'd never, and you're growing in and out of allergies and at any point of your life. And so it could be, you don't want it to happen. So making sure, and I know it's in another bag over there, but an event I did, I made sure that all the banquet captains, because this was a party for 15,000 people, but we had a full ingredient list of everything that was being served. And, it was in our back pocket. It wasn't for every server, but, the main leads of the event had it. So if anybody had a question, we could literally go down to the nitty gritty of what was in it. Right. And it should also come down to how it was prepared.
That's right. And to your point, and to Francois' point as well. There have been several studies on the adult onset of food allergy, and one that Northwestern released back in 2019 said that they surveyed about 40,000 U.S. adults, and they estimated that almost 11% of that survey, 10.8%, said they were food allergic at the time of the survey. Okay. Half of them said that they had at least one adult onset food allergy. So This has happened to my husband. This has happened to friends, foods they've eaten their entire lives, 10 years, 30 years. In one case, a 60-year-old friend of mine who has been able to eat the food every day, and then one day had a severe reaction. And if you're traveling, it is very likely, depending on where you are, you may eat a food you've never eaten before. How would you know you're allergic until you've tried it? So I think event venues, particularly those that host international conferences, it's critical that they understand, you may have folks who are eating that food for the first time.
That's a really, really good point, because you don't know what you're eating. And this is totally random, but on Instagram, I found a photographer, and he had taken some pictures, and he's environmental photographer talking about food and all of that. But he had taken pictures of forest ferns, and that is something that people eat in other parts of the world. And I commented on it, and I'm like, I actually had forest ferns when I found an organic farm in the Philippines like 10 years ago, and that's all they served me. And I'm like, I was fine with it. I didn't have any kind of reactions, but that's a food that I'd never eaten before, and who would have known, right?
Right.
But yeah, it's trying new foods, and maybe it messes with maybe you're on medication, and a spice that you ate in another country has a reaction with that medication that you don't have any idea of, right? Because
Correct.
I'm sure they're not testing it with the medical field's not testing all those drugs with all kinds of different foods. But yeah, so we could just talk about this so much more. What are the biggest emerging issues in the food allergy field? And we've got about 3 more minutes.
We've touched on two of the big ones. One is the
Okay.
temporary disruption in the supply chain because of COVID that has resulted in some suspension of existing labeling laws, as well as some substitutions that chefs and folks preparing food for large consumption may have to make. And therefore, what once were predictable ingredient lists may no longer be. That's a big concern that a lot of food allergic folks are having right now. I think emergency preparedness is an ongoing concern. A lot of folks that I have worked with think that their food allergy responsibilities end with the dining hall, but it's really about, as we talked about at the beginning of the show, understanding the laws related to, can you stock epinephrine in your venue? It's very easy to use. It's very easy to get a standing order. Some institutions may even qualify for donated devices. So what can you do in that regard? And then I think the last piece we touched on also is just how adults, the big cohort of food allergic kids, if you will, from 15, 20, 25 years ago are now young adults in the workplace. And I think we're going to start seeing a lot more dialogue about what employers' responsibilities are to their employees, in their work functions as it pertains to, food at conferences, food at staff meetings, food served on campus, etc.
So this person just piped in here. Hosts one in-person event every other year. How do you manage so many exceptions? We have a lean staff for about 480. So yeah, it's a great question, and it's a lot longer than the minute we have left, but it does take some due diligence. It's making sure that you ask the right questions, but it's working with those chefs, like Chef Francois, in advance, making sure, hey, these are the allergens that we had noted before. So when you're contracting with a venue, saying, how do you manage these? Can you show me some examples of menus that you've done that meet these needs, right? And but yeah, reach out. I can actually cover that in another thing, but it does take, Jen, that partnership on chef and meeting planner and attendee. What's that sweet spot of finding that conversation and finding for the different dietary needs? I mean, I had an event with 600 people, 200 dietary requests, and I got it down to only needing 30 personalized plates, or 35 personalized plates, because we worked the menu the right way. So it does take some effort. Right. But okay, so before we end, I always ask, what is your favorite food and beverage? And you have a secret you have an unusual allergy. I want to know that too.
My unusual allergy is conch, which is...
You eat that a lot.
Well, I discovered I was allergic in the Caribbean, and I'll just leave it at that. It's not a pretty discovery. It's not available where I live very often. But if I eat out at, let's say, a Caribbean-inspired restaurant, it sometimes is on the menu, and not pretty. My favorite food, I am revealing my New York roots, is a really good salt bagel with lox, cream cheese, red onion, and thinly sliced tomato, and an iced coffee on the side, decaf, because if I drink caffeine too late, it's crazy. Maybe followed by one of my brownies, because I'm a really good brownie baker. So not a low carb meal, but delicious.
But a delicious meal. Yeah. Well, I appreciate everything that you've done in your career and you being here today to shed some light on some of these laws and regulations that we have to pay attention to. And I think it's just a due diligence and a duty of care to understand them. So thank you for educating us.
It is. And there are lots of resources available online to learn what the laws are in your state. And I certainly think the FDA website is chock full of information about food labeling and what folks are required to do there.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you. You're welcome. And everybody, thank you for tuning in. This is the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where we talk about how to create safe, inclusive, and sustainable food and beverage experiences for everyone. Now, we have a Facebook group called Eating at a Meeting. It's free to join. Just find it on Facebook. And we're here every Wednesday live talking to a different expert in this field. And you can also check us out on all the podcast platforms. Until next time, stay safe and eat well. Thanks. Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.